All right, we're going to call to order the City Council special meeting of Monday, September 8th. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Edgar?
Here.
Councilmember Gross?
Here.
Councilmember Kusamoto?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Murphy?
Here.
Mayor Graham Mejia?
Here. We're going to go to special orders of the day. Item 3A, prioritization of replenishment of the general fund reserves. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to public comment. Anyone wishing to speak can come forward and speak at the podium. Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close public comment. Can we get a staff report, please?
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. I'll just introduce the item and then hand it over to our interim Director of Administrative Services, Glenn Steinbrink, for the presentation. This item tonight, two items before you on special orders of business. One is prioritization of the replenishment of the general fund reserves. This is a pickup of the discussion that we had during the budget sessions as we led to the adoption of the budget, and then we had an additional workshop on this item, and it's a continuation of that item. So we are planning on letting you know where we are right now with our general fund reserves, where we are right now with fiscal year 13-14, where we think we're heading, and then pick up the discussion that we had last with the City Council on this topic and also on a policy for internal service funds. And with that introduction, I'll hand it over to Glenn to start the presentation.
Perfect.
Good evening, Mayor, members of Council. I'll keep my comments very brief. I only have a few things to say about the general fund reserves. The general fund reserves, as you see in your staff report, projected at the end of 13-14 are just over $7 million. That number is net of the $1.5 million that we moved out of general fund into two new internal service funds. $700,000 into a police capital expenditures fund, $400,000 into a facility, streets, parks, and pool capital expenditures fund. So, in a sense, you might say that our general fund reserves are really $8.1 million, but I wanted to stress that those funds have already been moved into an internal service fund. As far as the total amount of general fund reserves that we show here in the staff report, there's only really one thing that changes the total of our general fund reserves each year, and that is the excess of revenues over expenditures. We do not yet know what the excess of revenues over expenditures is going to be for fiscal year 13-14. We are still closing the books on fiscal year 13-14. The auditors are due in a couple of weeks. They will audit those numbers, and so we won't have the final numbers, the audited numbers, until probably October. Whatever that number is in excess of budget, because this number is based upon what we estimated we would end 13-14, that number will be added to this total. I say added because it's highly likely that it's going to be higher than this amount. We just don't know yet higher by what amount. As far as the reserves that have already been established by City Council, and this policy has already been adopted by City Council, I just want to talk about a couple, and that is the reserve for emergencies, the 25% reserve for emergencies. That, too, was also based upon 25% of the general fund appropriations while we were going through the budget process. We have now finished the 14-15 budget. It's been adopted, and I know that the 25% reserves is actually more like $3,055,000 instead of $3,123,000. It dropped for any number of reasons that we decreased our appropriations in the general fund, such as moving the 800 megahertz appropriations out to the internal service fund, the departments reducing their expenditures, those types of things reduced the amount that we need in the 25% reserve. So that number will change to $3,055,000. And then finally, the PERS reserves. If you'll remember, originally it was staff recommendation to set the PERS reserves at $3.35 million, which would bring our funded level to 80% when you consider the assets that we have in PERS plus the amount we've set aside in the general fund would have caused us to be 80% funded. We reduced that amount by $200,000. That was part of the amount that we moved to the internal service fund for facility, streets, parks, and pool to make it $400,000. By lowering the PERS reserves to $3.15 million, it actually causes our funded amount to be just shy of 80%. It's like 79.5%, so it didn't have a major impact on the amount we've set aside for funding. As I stated in the staff report, we're going to be receiving an actuarial report from PERS this month that will update last year's report. In last year's report, we were 73% funded. We don't know what that percentage is going to be based on the next actuarial. My guess is that it's going to be up because the return on investment at PERS in fiscal year 12-13 was 13.2%, which is far above their actuarial assumption of 7.5%. So it's likely that the $3.15 million in reserves set aside for PERS can come down. It doesn't have to come down, but it can come down. That will be a decision that council will make when we get the report. Council can either increase the amount of the funding and say, well, if we're going to be, say, 85% funded, let's just leave it at 85% funded. Or they can leave it at 80%, or they can use some of that money to actually pay down the liability in PERS by sending more money to PERS, or some combination of those options. But I want to stress that that does not increase the general fund reserves. Whatever happens with PERS, it does not increase the $7 million. It's not a windfall to the city. It simply makes the funding that we have in CalPERS greater than what it is based upon the 11-12 actuarial report. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. As I say in the report, as of right now, these reserves are non-spendable, which means you haven't appropriated any portion of these general fund reserves, with the exception of the $40,000 that you appropriated for Los Alamitos Boulevard. There's $200,000 of the $7 million that's designated for Los Alamitos Boulevard, but council only appropriated $40,000 of that $200,000. That's the only portion of these reserves that are currently spendable, is the $40,000 that's designated for Los Alamitos. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Go ahead and bring it back to the council. Anyone have questions? Dean?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the report. I have some concerns because I think we're heading off into a direction that I don't think we should be going, and that is the adjustments of the 25% as a start. That it's, because it's the amount of the general fund, instead of being 3.123, it's going to be 3.055. I don't think that makes any difference because we do mid-year adjustments. The general fund may adjust at mid-year because of one reason or another, or money gets reallocated in it. I think it's appropriate that we look at the 25% figure and use that as the start figure, and at the end of the year when it's reconciled, if there was additional money that wasn't needed, no emergency occurred, then we could take action in terms of releasing that additional money, or being short money in the process, we could look at that point. But I just think this adds confusion by saying that because the general fund came in a little bit different than what was originally proposed, we can knock off $80,000 off of what's needed from the standpoint of the reserve for the emergency. And that's just my consideration at this point. I mean, it's money that's there, but basically is money that we're not touching anyhow. I just think we're safer to leave it with the 25%. The PERS thing, I think the same issue applies, that we allocate the 80% as the goal, because we already talked when we moved the 200,000 back that it may adjust it, that it's really not money that's there. I want to avoid the idea of getting into these funds for one reason or another, because something comes up that seems like we need to borrow it. We already agreed to take 200,000 out of PERS and move it over so that there was some flexible latitude for projects that may come in or may occur. I would rather us just stay with what we originally adopted, with the 80% on that and the 25%. The others really aren't a factor at this particular point. I do know that one of the things we talked about in some of these, because I think the police 800 megahertz amount, I don't know if that's really in this particular area, or is that part of
Second.
the internal fund?
Second.
Internal
It's
service.
the internal service fund, okay. All right, then I'll hold off on that. I would just say I think we should stay with what we originally agreed upon and not worry about the differences of change until the budget actually ends for 14-15.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Nope. All right. So are we in support of Dean's recommendation? And that would be the direction to staff? Anyone? I'm supportive of it, but I think it's a fine idea. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and ask you to make those changes.
Richard, you
I'm sorry, Richard.
I was going to ask.
acted like you were going
I
to
was going
talk.
to ask you could clarify. I'm in agreement. just like set a date and stick with it, you're saying. What date do you want to propose that we tell the staff to move forward? Is it the budget that's adopted at the first of the year?
We at July 1st, we adopted a budget, and we adopted those percentages based on that budget. And barring something dramatically different, I think we stay with the 25% and the 80%. And if it saves some money on the emergency part of things at the end of the year, we'll know whether we've needed the emergency money or not. And if there's extra money left over at that particular point, then we can talk about it going into next year's budget of how we want to make an adjustment.
I just wanted to clarify what
Yeah.
date we're starting with, so that's fine.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I may add to that, when you adopted the policy, you set that reserve at 25% of general fund appropriations. The $3.125 million is not right now 25% of general fund appropriations. The adopted budget, if I take the adopted budget and I take the general fund appropriations and I take 25% of that, that's the $3,055,000. And that's all I'm saying, that if, in order to stay in compliance with your policy that you've already approved for the general fund, the 25% emergency is the 3,055, $3,055,000. Also, your policy for the general fund requires that that is your minimum amount of reserves for the general fund, that it can never fall below that 25% of general fund appropriations. I don't think it'll ever get there, but if the economy got so bad that in any one year your reserves were going to fall below 25%, you would have to reduce general fund appropriations to bring it down to whatever your reserve is. You can never spend money that is the 25%. That's your minimum reserve. You cannot spend that money. Now, all of these reserves are non-spendable right now. That doesn't mean that at some point in the future, council cannot appropriate some of this money. You can never appropriate the 25% of general fund appropriations
Unless there's an emergency.
unless there's an actual emergency. That's correct.
Well, Glenn, couldn't the council take action to change that percentage? We've done it in the past.
You could, in which case we would have to bring the policy back to council. Now, that policy has already been adopted, it's already been approved by council.
Right.
And
I'm just
you-
saying in times, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
No,
but
no,
in
that's
times where the
fine.
economy's very difficult for us and say we needed to use some of that, council has the purview to bring it back, discuss it, and
That's
change it through a
correct.
resolution.
It
correct?
would take an action of council to change it.
Great. Okay, Troy?
Yeah, a couple things. I agree with Dean, but I think more specifically in the policy, each one of these 6 categories has more specific rules is what I think you're adding. So even the example used at 25%, we will maintain at least 25% or greater than. And then your caveat was, and we will not do mid-year adjustments to start consuming that money because we don't know what's going to happen in the year until the following fiscal year budgeting process, I think. So I'm completely supportive there. The way the subject of this staff report was written, the prioritization of replenishment of general fund reserves, kind of made me think that this was more of trying to establish the mechanics of what happens during each one of these 6 items as a condition, even if it is at the budget planning for the next year, to stop us from having arguments up here of how to spend these excess. And so something that I would like to have looked at, it doesn't have to happen tonight, but each one of these conditions are, reserved for emergencies, PERS reserves. The PERS, there's going to be a PERS report that comes out in a month, and some of us have been from the very beginning saying that PERS liability was ridiculous and that we shouldn't be overcommitting assets to it. But we're going to find out how that really plays out. And then, again, we'll probably have another discussion of, oh, my God, what if we have all this upside now that's less than the amount 3.15 that we put in there. We only need 2.8 now, so now what happens? So the way this reserve policy is written is that these would all shift to undesignated reserves, and we'd start seeing that number build up mechanically. And then we'll start going, oh, then Jerry weighs in, hey, well, what about the parks? And then we start getting into an argument of what? I thought this was more philosophical of, look, if we had a matrix for these are the 6 conditions. This is it's a minimum, maximum, or whatever. We don't touch it until the fiscal year in the matrix. And then what happens for the excess reserve? Right now it goes to the undesignated. And from the undesignated, mechanically, what happens? What got us here, I think, when Mayor was saying, hey, look, I'd like to see some mechanical allocation, like real quickly. And what I'd like to see is that when things come out of the general fund as a reserve balance, because of these machinations of PERS liability, a percentage of general fund budget at 25%. We have 2 other categories. One we're going to talk about, which was your point, which is internal service funds, ISF, so what goes into that bucket. And then the other one we don't talk about tonight, which is a shame, is CIP budgets. Specifically, pool, parks, streets. Streets, we need to start, I think, have a mechanical process, and I've thought that's what this was to say, these are the 6 conditions, but then if you have an excess, so you don't fight over it, at the budget process, it goes into internal service funds to fund the shortfall that we have in the garage fund, 1.2 million, we only have 50,000 a year going in there now. Or it goes into streets or parks and recreation. In the streets, we have $400,000 a year budget, we need 600, we need to start building that up. Then let the CIP process or the ISF process work through the allocation by staff, the experts, not all of us that are politically fighting for our specific things that we feel really important. And even the example of the park that Jerry and I were trying to have focus on, the argument could be made, hey, is that park really the most important park? Well, then we'd go to Corey and say, what does the study say? And the study would say how you prioritize the CIP budget, not how you prioritize spending real money found on the street here. So I don't know, what I was hoping to be able to find, Dean, and for your consideration, if you're going to make a motion that, we're basically codifying this, saying that really addition to the policy from what you're saying is, and we won't spend it in the year until we get ready for the next fiscal year budgeting, and then we won't spend it till the following year after we go through the budget process. I'm 100% on board, but I'd like to see more specifics on our policy by category, mechanically spell out what it goes, and then at the end, what happens to undesignated reserves. So it isn't a free-for-all fight-off here for our own pet projects. I'd like to see it go to the process of staff to then prioritize. So I'm interested if you would think about doing that, and it doesn't have to come back per se like in real time, but at least between now and the next budgeting cycle, we can start to put together and refine our policy.
I totally agree with you where you're headed. The concern I had is the same thing. There's going to be nickels and dimes in comparison to the big picture that will be a little bit over, a little bit under. We set this up at the start when we adopt the budget. And those adjustments up and down, we could find, like we have, tax revenues aren't coming in the way we expected, or one of the major tax producers encounters a major default of fire, as an example, and suddenly we lose revenue from one of the major ones. Those are issues we deal with potentially throughout the year and make adjustments. This is pretty well fixed, yet it doesn't mean that it's cast so, in my mind, cast so tight in stone that we can't go back and look at it. And the other part that concerns me is that in some aspects we have a balanced budget, but that budget is balanced on the back of the reserves that now have been identified in different areas, because we're taking the 800 megahertz as an example. We're taking 77,000 in theory out of the reserves that didn't exist before, putting it into an internal service fund with the understanding that that fund gets rebuilt on a yearly basis. At least that was my interpretation when we first started talking about it, is that theoretically 20 years from now, when the radios have to be replaced again, there's going to be money aside for that particular purpose, which, we can't speak to the council 20 years from now, but at least there'll be something there, hopefully left at that particular point.
But, and just my response, because I know you're responding to my comment, is I am more concerned about us having a balanced budget on some of the assumptions that are even more, like parking meter and some of these things that may or may not even happen in the timing. So I'm hesitant to want to put into a mechanical process to go spend money. So that's why I'm 100% behind your motion there.
And that's where I'm at, is that I'm not looking to spend money out of it. I'm looking to set us on the policy we already adopted.
Okay.
And we'll be able to look at that at the end of the calendar year, at the end of the fiscal year, to determine how good we did in that regard.
Thank you.
We're
Okay.
relying on staff anyhow, so.
So we understand, staff, the direction that Councilmember Gross is making and the council supports. Okay, so no other further action needed because this has already been codified. Okay, so we move on to item 3B, fund balance policy for internal service funds. Staff report, public comment. Anyone wishing to speak, please come to the podium. Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Staff report, please.
Okay, now with regard to the internal service funds, this policy was not adopted by City Council. City Council asked us to bring it back, in particular because the allocation for the garage fund was based upon the vehicle replacement policy, which determines when a vehicle should be replaced based on the passage of time and not based upon the condition of the vehicle or the equipment. So council asked us to bring the statement back, that schedule that shows the replacement of the vehicles, and set it up so that we determine how much money we would need based upon the condition of the vehicle or the equipment, and when we really realistically believe that this equipment or vehicle needs to be replaced. So the schedule is exactly the same as what was given to you the last time. The only difference is that the very last column on each of the first and second pages where it shows bump year. The bump year is Tony's best estimate as to when these vehicles or this equipment need to be replaced based upon the condition of the vehicle or the condition of the equipment, that we can't really go much further beyond that year. We've given a priority to public safety on this statement, so the bump year is very recent for most of the police equipment. In other words, we either should have replaced it by now or we need to replace it within the next 1 or 2 years. For all of the other equipment, we went out a little bit further on the timeline, but it was felt that the police equipment really is important. For every mile that you put on a police vehicle, it's like putting 2 miles on any other vehicle. So if you have 40,000 miles on a police vehicle, it's really like having 80,000 miles on a police vehicle. And that's because of the way that they're driven. They do a lot of idling. They're driven a lot of hours per day. Any number of reasons that there's more wear and tear on the police vehicles. We felt it was important to replace those on a timely basis. So what I did was I took the bump year and I said, okay, I'm going to allocate the amount to the departments based upon we need to replace this vehicle in the year that Tony has told me that's it needs to be replaced within that year. And I only did it for 5 years. I didn't feel it was necessary to go beyond 5 years because it sort of flattens out after 5 years and stays pretty much the same. Now, in the policy, I set the allocation to the garage fund at $50,000 a year. I knew when I did that that was not going to be enough money to replace the vehicles on an as-needed basis. I also knew that the city doesn't have the money that's needed to send over to the garage fund to replace it based upon the condition of the equipment. So you'll see on the last page, in the first year, the total amount of money that we would need to spend out of the garage fund in the first year to replace the vehicles and equipment would be $663,000. The second year, $307,000. The third year, $266,000. Fourth year, $255,000, and then it starts to level out. So it's really about $250,000 a year or so that we would need to allocate every year. We're starting at 50. We're way under where we need to be. The plan is to work towards stabilizing the fund at $250,000 a year. If the city had the money, I would love to see seed money transferred over to the garage fund to help us with replacing these vehicles on a more timely basis. The original thought was, when we set it at $50,000, was, okay, we'll establish it at $50,000 a year, and if we have certain vehicles that need to be replaced, we'll come back to council and say, we need more money transferred to the garage fund because these certain vehicles need to be replaced. So the plan is to work towards $250,000 a year. $50,000 a year is just a starting point. I think staff's recommendation would be, in any year that revenues exceed expenditures in the general fund, that we consider taking some portion of that amount and transferring it to the garage fund to try to replenish the garage fund. The other internal service funds at this point in time are in good shape. It's only the garage fund, I think, that needs additional money. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We'll bring it back to council. Any questions?
I just
Troy?
got a statement. So now that we're, from the previous discussion, what we said is if we were to set this thing up right, as long as we had, like you just said, for the garage fund, a $250,000 a year target, that would be great. 1.2 is our overall liability, but on steady state, 250. As long as we were able to have that amount, if our policy at the general fund level for excesses said that it maybe on a 50-50 basis, it goes CIP and ISF, and then we let the council with staff decide where to push it down into the details, I think that that is a way that, at least as a policy, we can mechanically set up, and that's probably as low as we can go before the politics get involved in what we care about the most. So again, going back to where Dean was on his initial thing, if the matrix set up, it pushes money to the ISF. I usually have an argument of, is this the right schedule? I think we got the right schedule here now. We just can't afford it yet. And then this looks like it's set up for next year's budgeting. The one you didn't talk about, though, was the 800 megahertz, the whole police, we actually funded this year, and we said, hey, we never want that to happen again. Talk about that. What's the baseline amount for that? Because that's a new allocation on the departments too, right?
That's correct. We're allocating $35,000 a year for 20 years. That's the $700,000 that we really need right now for the CAD RMS and the 800 megahertz system. We're going to grow that $35,000 every year by CPI. So that money that we're going to start setting aside in 15-16, that $35,000, that's going to grow a little bit each year, that's going to purchase the next CAD RMS system, not the one we're going to be buying over the next 6 or 7 years,
Yeah.
but the one that we're going to purchase 15, 20 years from now.
But to paint a full picture for us on the council is, you got the 250 that we can't afford, but we're going to throw 50 out as a start point, and that's a great idea. We've got another 30 in a new fund that we set up this year, so that means we're at 280. We're not funding the pool up to the level to maintain it. Once we get a lease in place, we'll do that, so we're short there. And we're also short on streets, where we hope to be able to get another $200,000, because right now we depend on 100% of grants and allocations in funds that actually come to us either through street and road tax, the gas tax and all that. So I mean, if you add up that, we're $400,000 to $500,000 a year now that we're financially kind of straightening ourselves up on our funds, that eventually these reserves need to be pushed towards to seed fund them. But even steady state, we're still $400,000 to $500,000 short, because we don't have a structural revenue source to catch up with our new budget.
I would agree with that.
And then this is going to get into our business case stuff down the road, but I think we really have a structural problem coming that we're going to set up and do to ourselves for the right reasons. We can't afford it, but we need to, and I think we're going to see the hard reality of really how short we are, and then I think we'll step back and look at the reserves and see how precious that really is, and how much can we fund it in the short term, but we better start fixing the revenue projection of how we can kind of increase revenue within the city somehow, because I think we're short, big time.
Exactly correct.
Anything else?
No.
Anyone else has anything to add? Dean?
I'd like to look at this from a little bit different perspective, particularly where we're talking the garage fund. The garage fund, as we've known it, really isn't a garage fund. It's salaries and benefits for public works and garage-related items, as I understand it.
It's really the fleet maintenance fund and the fleet replacement fund rolled into one fund.
Okay, but I'm code enforcement and I have one car and assigned to me, and it's part-time. I'm paying a certain amount of money in as code enforcement to this garage fund, which is up to this particular point been used to fund the mechanic and parts and equipment for the entire fleet.
Gasoline, oil, parts, the
So my
mechanic.
question
yeah.
is, why is that created, or was that created, and you guys can help me here maybe from history-wise, why was that created as a fund rather than a separate department? Parks and Recreation doesn't get money from police, and police doesn't give money to Parks and Recreation, and yet they're separate departments. But every department is paying for the mechanical fleet. and not every department has the same component in that mechanical fleet. It just seems to me that we've called the garage fund, and I think the interpretation, at least from my standpoint, is that that's vehicles, that's replacement of vehicles. You could go the same thing with the technology fund, that's replacement and upgrade of computers and programs and software as needed, and yet we're paying salaries and what I would consider the same thing like buying office supplies to a different department in that particular fashion. And it just doesn't seem right that we've got one department that is being funded by the rest of the city to maintain parts of it. And it would seem to be more logical to create those jobs in a department function, i.e. Public Works, whatever, and then when we talk about equipment and the funding of equipment, that's purely what we're talking about. And we've not been talking. At the budget session, I said, I can't believe that a department head is paying money in knowing full well that that's not going to replace a car. Well, they knew that. I didn't realize that, but they knew that. There's equipment on the list here that goes, and it's all part of the total amount that goes further down in terms of, lawnmowers, aero boards, things of that, and I realize that it's been scheduled out based on what we anticipate, but like the light bars that are on the police cars, those have changed and upgraded at least 3 different times since I've been involved with the council, and they're getting better. Everything is going to LED, it's brighter, it's less drain on the vehicles. At the DUI checkpoint, they had 2 or 3 police cars parked out actually on the boulevard with lights flashing, and they had to send an officer out somewhere, and I said, I hope the car starts. Oh, it'll start, because it's been running the entire time. Well, that's part of what beats up vehicles. Maybe that's normal police activity, and how they do that, and that's the operational, and I don't want to get into that part, but it just seems like the mechanical issues that we're dealing with in terms of equipment. We bought a new fork aerator for the parks, and I don't know what the lifespan of that is. It's kind of like when we were fixing the street sweeper on a continual basis and having to buy tires and other things. Those are things. Yet we've got people at this point mixed in with the things, and I'm not sure that's a smart way to go.
So Dean, if I could ask you for clarification, so what you're saying is you want to bifurcate the two. You want to have equipment be one, in essence, department, and then the cost for the employees doing the work in a separate. Is that?
Well, it would seem to me that would be the right way to go, because the same thing if we're buying things for other departments, we look to, we can get a better deal going here, we can get a better deal going there, and it's things, it's not people. But up until this point, everything related to vehicles, mechanical-wise, has been part of the labor aspect of it. And it
Yeah.
seems like there's help me.
Well,
Is that right?
just to add a historical perspective, so the garage fund, 2 completely separate things, the operation and maintenance of the mechanics and the fees. And the reason why I personally think that that's always been in an allocation is because, police has a $5 million budget, and so they pay a bigger allocation because they got more cars and more needs. And therefore, Tony's folks have to do more work there. The capital stuff that you're talking about is really what we're talking about tonight, the service fund, that $250,000. In the past, we've stopped spending money on things because we want to focus on maintaining people hard times. And you brought, this is consistent with what you said in the budget workshop, as hey, does everybody realize they're not getting new cars? No, they knew they were paying into a fund. They just, and I think staff knew it. We may not have recognized it, but staff knew that we shut the valve off on buying things, and they were really just paying for the maintenance of Tony's guys. I think it's an interesting concept to have a bifurcation, as the mayor says, to be able to have, plan it like you would a department, within Public Works, you have maintenance, and, and then ask the question to Glenn or to Brett, does the cost of maintenance really fluctuate right now, or is it pretty steady state? That would be a good reason to keep it in a department. but keep the equipment separate. I do think the service fund is a great idea to fund, because it makes them all, the city, work together. If Bruce is sitting there and he's like, God, I need police cars, and, someone in Public Works is like, are you serious again? They've got to fight it out and have, that's why I love this spreadsheet, is they have to fight it out and agree, this is, you can call it the dump date or whatever, but they have to say, hey, this is how much we need, and it's $250,000. I can live with that. And so I think it's a very good idea, and maybe that is something we should think about for our planning for next year. So the answer, I think, to your question, I guess, Brad and Glenn, is that feasible? It's an interesting concept to break out O&M outside. I'm giving you the historical perspective, but I guess on a functional go-forward basis, is that a problem?
If we could we get the historical, since we are not as in tune with it as the staff is,
Yeah.
and then we can go back to Glenn with that. Tony, if you would give us a background of why the fund was structured that way, and if you see a benefit to that, and if you would like to recommend that we don't go that way, maybe you give us those reasons.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, as my memory serves me, okay, from about about 1998, prior to myself being here, till about 2006-07. Okay, the garage fund was set up by Gerard Goodhart to have two functions, like we've been discussing. One function was to repair the vehicles, which would include the mechanic, your oil, parts, repairs to the hydraulic lift in the shop. So encompass everything of that would run a shop. The second was for replacement. Okay, as long as I can remember, we've always had the budget of the mechanic and the operations pretty steady Eddie. Okay, as you don't replace vehicles, your parts and labor go up. As you replace vehicles, they go down. So you'll see it kind of fluctuate throughout the years. We've always kept it that way as far as budgeting, and I think Mr. Egger said it the same way. As the police, we charge them a greater amount because we're working on their vehicles a lot more than, say, recreation's 2 vehicles. Okay, so that's how that has always been set up in the past. As far as charging the departments for the vehicles, that was always set up, I believe, as a separate entity, but when times got tough, we would stop charging. So you would see in the individual budgets of the individual departments, you would see their shop contributions go down, therefore to keep a balanced budget.
Right.
But the shop has always been funded, as I can recall.
Okay,
That
great.
answered your
Well,
question.
that makes perfect sense, that, as the vehicles are replaced, and you get newer vehicles, there's less repairs, so that makes good sense. Warren, could he answer Troy's question, or do you have something to add before Glenn answers?
I'd like to continue the
Okay.
discussion. Sorry, Glenn, so I'm going to kind of poke at this a little bit, so thank you, Mayor. So it seems like then, and this may be going off topic, but on the labor component of the operations and maintenance, is that a variable tax on the departments? It'll change year after year?
Currently, what we charge the departments is for materials, supplies, and then the labor is, say, I'm not an accountant, but
Sure.
They would take the salary of the employee, okay, and they would divide it by the number of vehicles that the department has, such as police has the most vehicles, therefore they pay the most salary of the
So that'll be a total aggregate of the salary divided by some metric of quantity of whatever, you can count tires or whatever, or headlights or whatever it is. But, okay, I get that, but I think what Dean proposed is sort of an interesting idea. If you were to just get a lump sum of money allocated, appropriated, and then you have to service the different departments, and there's no, I'll say, tax on the departments, right? It's just a way of funding it, but it's just a matter of how you arrive at the number, right? You could just say, I have so many cars to maintain, I need X amount of dollars per car for my labor, and then
Correct.
cars, right?
When I would do my budgeting, I would, with
Okay.
police vehicles, if we have more new vehicles, I'd
Because the budgeting process would be, you say, I have, Bruce has so many cars, Corey has so many cars, Steve has so many cars, and you'd say this would be the allocation, right?
Right,
You're
correct.
doing it anyway, so
Right.
you're just getting the money through the height of these folks versus coming to the council. So it's the same thing, but does it stay pretty much steady except for the salary increases over time?
Yes
Because
and no. I mean,
you know-
it stays pretty steady. You know, if I know that we're coming into new vehicles, such as if we go back in history when we changed from the Ford Crown Victorias to the Dodge Chargers, we knew that when we got we had 6 new Dodge Chargers, 3 in 1 year, 3 in the next year, yet they were all purchased between June and July, but it was 2 different fiscal years. I knew that the next fiscal year, I can drop my parts and my outside labor to those vehicles because I have new vehicles. And then over the next 3 to 5 years, I would have to steadily increase that as we would have to pay for the parts. We would have to start doing the repairs. Okay.
But that would be an allocation on the departments
Correct.
as a function of how many cars they have.
Correct.
Okay, but now, that the workforce, the labor, the noses that you have, that's a kind of a fixed number then, right?
Yes, it
So
is.
the only variability is if there's overtime involved or any salary increases over a period of time. Okay.
Correct.
So it's just a matter of how you go and get your money. You just either tax these guys or you can come to us. So the bifurcation is not wouldn't be that complex of a process then.
On this side, it would be the same process.
Yeah.
You know, the work
Okay.
still would need to be done. You know.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so Glenn, could we go back to Troy's question? Troy, thanks for
no.
giving us that opportunity.
And Tony, to follow on to Warren's question, specifically, the budget's about 260 to 300,000 a year, and it's been that amount every year for the last 5 or 6 years that I've been following it. So it really isn't super variable,
Not really variable.
Okay.
Yeah, not that much.
and that's why I'm kind of interested in that. And so, do
Yeah.
you see a problem, Glenn, with that strategy, or
Well, I'll give you the accounting answer. First of
is
all,
this the wet blanket, or just?
the purpose of an internal service fund in the first place is to set up a place in your budget for operations that provide services to all of the other departments of the city. That's the true definition of an internal service fund, is that it's a cost center, and it's used to set up allocations to all of the other departments in the city to which services are provided. You don't set one up for police and you don't set one up for Parks and Rec because typically Parks and Rec doesn't provide services to the police department, and you don't set one up for police because typically they don't provide services to Parks and Rec. Once in a while they do, but not typically. True internal service department always provides services to all the other departments of the city. In every city that I've ever seen that has a vehicle replacement fund or an equipment replacement fund, whatever you want to call it, it's still an internal service fund. So the mechanics, like Tony said, would be exactly the same as what we're doing now. So if you wanted to bifurcate the garage fund into 2 components, that which is salaries and benefits, maintenance and operations, and separate that from vehicle and equipment replacement, you could do that, but it's still going to be done the same way. You're still going to have charges to all of the departments, you're still going to bring money into those 2 funds, and you're going to use that money for that purpose for which it was established. So the one fund would pay for the mechanic and the oil and the gasoline and the parts and labor and everything else, and the other fund would pay for the replacement of equipment.
So the accounting answer is the recommended best practice, but I'll give you kind of an example too, and I think it depends on how big the municipality or the city or whatever is, because, for example, even within our city, HR, secretary, payroll, that is a core function, and instead of charging it as internal service fund, we put it in the city manager's budget. And it's just the materiality of that, you know, and I think the specific question, I understand the best practice from an accounting, but if you had the ISF fund that had this and you broke O&M separately and you kept the replacement fund in the ISF, can you, I know it's against the best practice, but can you put that into the general fund budgeting and budget it just like you do the city manager department, which has council support, it's got secretaries, it's got all of the services that kind of go to all the departments. Is that acceptable, or is there a hardened accounting rule of why you couldn't do it?
It's acceptable. There's no accounting requirement that you have internal service fund.
Within the city manager fund, which I also think has the city clerk costs in it too, which has 2 heads in there, or part-time heads. I guess without getting into details, I think we have precedent for setting it. I'm not saying we should go there, but I think that it could work. Is there any other accounting reasons other than the rule? But, I mean, I'm thinking now pragmatically the budgeting process. So we get to year end, the departments are all high-fiving each other because of the O&M, we just took that burden of the 270,000 out. So, but guess what? They're getting another tax called replacements. So they're about feeling equal. You know, they lost something, they gained something. You know, Tony's fighting a new fight. He's never had to fight before. That's him and talking with city manager, coming in with you, saying, guys, this is what I need. And he's susceptible to the 2% reduction across the board type discussions, everything else. And by the way, he's also susceptible to an allocation for the internal service fund in the future for replacement. So he's got his 250 plus. At the end, it's still money we don't have. Next year, when we start even the $50,000, we don't have $50,000 extra in the budget unless we have really creative revenue assumptions next year that we can fill this hole. So I still think it's a net 0 to negative, but again, we're starting to codify a policy we're not going to be able to afford, and I think to get to the details of your staff report, the $50,000 recommendation is very prudent, even though it should be $250, and it just again highlights the hole that I think we're going to have here. But Dean, I'm very interested in looking at that as a.
You know, my thinking is that the money's all in the general fund, and payroll is one bucket, regardless of where it is, whether it's the city manager or police or anything else. They all have to deal with personnel and payroll. But when you buy the stuff that's needed to support that, it comes out of a different pocket from the standpoint of, or a different bucket. And to me, that's where I see the vehicles and the equipment is more in that bucket, and it doesn't really reflect the personnel. It would seem like it would make it easier to say, total city-wise, we've got 60 employees, full-time or whatever it is. This is what it costs us personnel-wise, and it's very clear. And it's not broken up in the same way that it is right now. When there's an item that's needed and we have to go purchase something, it comes out of either a capital item, capital purchase type of a thing, or something that's budgeted, and essentially the spreadsheet helps tell us what we need budgeted-wise in the ideal situation, assuming all the funds are there.
Right.
Just seems like it would be a cleaner way than calling a garage fund by using all of the personnel dollars that are involved in the same way. It doesn't change. I think it's the same money in the same pot. It's basically how it's broken out accountability-wise.
Right.
Because your guys do parks maintenance, landscape, things like that the same way, don't they?
As-
You have division.
Yeah, the way that I understand it, we have the Public Works budget, which we have certain divisions in it.
Yeah.
We have, like, you're correct, we have street division, parks division. One of those divisions is fleet maintenance,
Okay.
okay? And out of that fleet maintenance, we have, you know, the salaries and benefits, and we also have the M&O, okay? In that budget, though, I guess I would go to you and say, yes, I've never seen, other than the schedule that we have here, we haven't really had an actual schedule printed in the budget to say how much is actually there for replacement. Have you seen
Well,
something to that
that's
effect in the
because there
past?
hasn't been anything for replacement.
Yeah, it's convenient when we
I
don't
just,
have them out there, but yeah.
Yeah.
Would that make it simpler, or maybe not simpler, but would that make it more transparent, more defined from the standpoint of doing that?
I mean, the way that Tony just described it, it's laid out in the budget operationally with personnel, wages, benefits, supplies, operating charges, each one of the Public Works divisions is laid out that way, including the fleet maintenance. So the fleet maintenance just happens to be one division which is used as an internal service fund and gets charged back to the departments, because as Glenn described, it's a service in itself. So there, you could do it either way. I mean, but it is laid out to where you can see the wages and benefits and operational charges in that one division, just like you can with all the others. It just,
Okay.
behind the scenes, there's a revenue source that's going into that division to pay for the operational charges. And what we're talking about here is, in addition to that, $1.2 million worth of capital that will also get charged back to the departments as an internal service fund. So you can do it either way. I just think if you're, like Glenn said, if it's a true internal service fund and you're doing it the right way, you're charging it back appropriately and allocating it appropriately to all the departments depending on the vehicles that are in that fleet.
Okay, great. We're going to go ahead and give Richard an opportunity.
Thank you. I like the bifurcation idea, particularly because we were able to basically, we're going to use the word, hide the fact that we didn't account for any vehicles for 6 years, which got us to the surprise that you mentioned the last time. So if we had two funds, we would be able to realize that there is no money going in the fund to buy more vehicles. I think that's an excellent idea and would really give us a lot more accountability. I like on the flip side, I like the old way we account for the percentages. I think that's important. And Brett, I would suggest, from what Tony said, I'd like to look at the allocations and make sure that it's a full allocation. It sounded like the way it was being done, it was going to be short. That if you take a guy's salary, you're really not taking all his costs, and you're not taking his supervisor's percentage overhead, for the normal accounting term, that we're probably undercharging the other departments for that fund. Now, as has been said, it all comes out of the same pot in the end. I do think, though, that the having the fund gives us more accountability and gives us a truer picture of what department is spending what. But I certainly would like to hear your guys' thoughts on the bifurcation, especially since it then would show us that money is being put aside for vehicles. Thank you.
I'm just going to throw something in. I think leaving it the way it is okay with me, especially because staff says that's the common way of doing it. But is it possible for us, for clarification purposes, for a report to be driven with that information they're asking through the bifurcation, so that's something we can track much easier? Because it is difficult when you're going through so many things go to different departments or different funds. It can get tedious trying to track the money, and I understand what Troy is saying. So for me, I'm supportive of leaving it as an internal service fund because I think it does what it's supposed to, but getting some kind of a report that would be generated where all the purchases are on one of any kind of equipment, so that it's clear to the council what we're spending, what we need, and any other kind of items they want differentiated. Warren?
Okay, thank you, Mayor. So I think if I understand the kind of the layout of the whole topic here, the internal service fund for replacement of capital items, vehicles, and that, I understand that as a function, as a percentage of the user group. So I think that makes sense to Troy's statement. The labor part, I think what Dean is poking at, I want to go for bifurcation, but I'm not going to insist on it or see that it has to happen this year or even next year. But I want to plant the seed, and the idea is that because that way, he already knows, Tony already knows what his needs are in terms of labor, right? It's a simple equation, X amount of bodies, and then the parts, you're just basically estimating it, right, based on your best experience.
Correct.
But what happens if, in some future date, that there's an opportunity for his department to service trucks from Long Beach? The city of Long Beach has an overflow of maintenance needs. If we don't have this thing broken out separately, then how do you allocate the cost, right? And so if he's got a fixed set of a population of workers, he can kind of start maybe picking up extra work, and there's another revenue source, perhaps, right? A make or buy decision could be made by any one of our neighbors here, and if they can get it done cheaper, why wouldn't they come to him? But if you don't know the true cost, you know, if it's buried in these budgets, then you really don't know what it is, right? Then you know, you can't get there. But if he has his own domain in terms of cost, then he can kind of grow it or shrink it depending on what the market does for him. But that's kind of how I look at it. But that may be a dream. You may not get there, but certainly, I think having it bifurcated, allocate the material or the capital cost to the users, fine. But the labor cost, we already know what that is. It's steady state, and then you can expand and contract as you know, your customer base may increase or decrease. So, anyways, that's what I'd like to see. But I don't know if you ever get there.
So then, let me ask, I'll poll the council. So if we do the bifurcation, then it is no longer really an internal service fund in the definition that you gave. Is that correct, Glenn?
That's correct. Only the vehicle and equipment replacement portion would be an internal service fund.
Okay. So, go ahead, Richard.
I'm sorry. You can't do a bifurcation within the internal service fund between,
You can, but I thought what I heard was the recommendation was just to show the vehicle maintenance just like another department within the city and no longer allocate those amounts to all of the other departments.
okay, well, that's been kicked around. I mean, there's been a lot of ideas here, but I
But
just
you
want
can
to...
do, you can do it
Okay,
either
well,
way.
that's what I wanted just to
Yeah,
make
you can
sure.
do it either way. You can you can treat it as two separate internal service funds and have two separate allocations to the departments so that you know for each department how much they're paying for vehicle maintenance and how much they're paying for vehicle and equipment replacement.
Okay, just so it's clear, okay.
Does that make a lot more work for staff, just out of curiosity?
No.
No, okay, great. So, does anyone want to make, I don't know if we need to make a motion, but why don't we poll the council to how they would like to see this handled moving forward? Dean, it was you that came up with the idea, it's all your fault.
I assume the Budget Ad Hoc Committee continues on in this process. Would that be something that committee could work with staff on to come back?
Do you want us to?
Well,
Yeah, I mean, we would. But to be honest, and I'll say it because Carrie's sitting next to me, is that I think that Budget Ad Hoc Committee got killed off officially and then has to be restarted. But if you restart it and put us or whoever's on it, I think that would be the right thing to do. And it kind of goes towards what Warren is saying. It probably should be a theoretical discussion of how to handle it. And I think you heard, whether we all agree or not, it's going to be planned in the department. It's just the funding source is what we're really talking about. Is it a tax, or because Tony's got a budget the same way he did last year?
Well, Richard kind of mentioned, you know, and I think I said it is coming out of the same general fund. It just seems like, I'm not sure that all of the departments should be paying for the public works people. It's an expense.
Well, you're going to fight that fight when right when we get to the budget. I think on board everybody's saying, hey, this is a good idea, but I'm not sure we're ready to give the direction.
Well,
Yeah, but I'm there. I do agree with you.
Okay, so we'll address that maybe at one of the future meetings, putting together another ad hoc, and that can be discussed in greater detail. Warren?
Do we need to wait for a future meeting? I think that based on what Dean was saying, maybe we could start the ad hoc for just to look at this and come back with some ideas. I feel there's some unintended consequences in this whole discussion anyways, and I think, you know, I'd look at Glenn and Brett to see, you know, what have other cities have done, other municipalities, and where does that kind of bite them? Because there's probably something in this, you know, idea that, you know, will be unintended and may not be good, so.
It might be, like Glenn's thought of, or he threw out the possibility of having two internal service funds. So you're still charging them back,
Sure.
the departments, but one is for all the capital, which now, by the way, does include all equipment. So, you know, that's the other fiscally prudent piece of this, and the reason that it's going up to the 250,000, it's not just vehicles, it's all equipment. But, so you could have two down the line. It would be something worth kicking around with the ad hoc committee.
I think that
That's what
makes
you
the
guys
best
wanna do.
sense. You know, that way you get the trackability that we're talking. It's still the internal service fund, so the process is still the same, and we're not micromanaging to a point where we're, you know,
So
like
I'll-
Warren said, stepping in it
Yeah.
unintentionally.
So I'm going to ask maybe for Troy and for Richard, then, is it something that you can see doing now if we were to agree to an ad hoc? Is that something that would make sense, or do we want to wait till mid-year, or what? I mean, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, anytime we could remove things that we got to push, because the last one, we were coming in weekly just to deal with
So
tactical
I'd like
things.
to make a motion that we christen an ad hoc committee consisting of Mayor Pro Tem Murphy and Councilmember Edgar to go off and look at this and come back within the next couple meetings with some kind of at least a study, and maybe not recommendation, but, just look at it and poke at it, so.
Okay.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, so all in favor? Aye. Okay, motion passes. So moving on to the adoption of the resolution. Do we have a motion on that?
I'm sorry, what was that, Jerry?
The recommended action, adopt the resolution number 2014-23 entitled, Resolution of the City Council of the City of Los Alamitos, California, establishing a fund balance policy for the internal service funds. Are we not going to be able to move forward with that because of
Can
the
I
ad
ask
hoc?
Glenn, did we say anything that just went against that? I mean,
No, you didn't say anything that went against the policy. The policy is very general
Okay.
and just really establishes a starting point for a policy to replenish these funds. And it's, as was said with the general fund policy, it can be changed at any time. If there's any portion of this policy you want to amend,
Yeah.
you can do that at any time.
I'm going to make braces out of it.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So do we have a motion for the recommended action?
Also move.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Yes.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, do we need to read it? Or did it cover it when I read it the first time? We're good to go. Okay, so I think with that, we'll go ahead and adjourn. Go ahead.
If I can make a comment, just a real quick comment. I had an opportunity to meet with Corey Williams from the Townsend Group, and it was sort of an impromptu. I was with Director Mendoza, and we thought it was going to be something with the 405, but it turned out to be something else. And I think that the something else was Townsend Public Affairs is out there looking after us, and I would like for us to consider perhaps some type of retainer agreement with them.
Councilman, not on the agenda.
Yeah, no, I want, no, okay, hang on, so,
It's a special meeting.
yeah, okay, so I want to, okay, I can't bring it to next meeting?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Then I would like to, perhaps, we'll look at that for a future meeting, but I think it was something that was very fruitful. So, thank you, City Attorney.
All right, so thank you to staff. Great job, Glenn. You've been a huge help.
Thank you.
All right. Dean?
Could I ask that we put on an agenda for a future meeting, discussion regarding specifically the pool and maintenance from the standpoint of the pool? And can I say where I'm heading with this?
No.
All right, so anyone else want to try?
Oh, come on, seriously?
Go ahead, I'm
After
daring you.
that?
I'm daring you
No.
all.
Well, I
All right,
have nothing to
so,
say.
Closing the meeting at 6:15.
Cool.